Good afternoon, madame, monsieur, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Transgressive Urge. Last night, we unleashed the North American premiere of Rob Jabaz's The Sadness, an assaulting, taboo-smashing roller coaster of confrontation and shock that's been recognized as the most transgressive horror film made in a decade. I can't imagine a better suited follow-up to that than this afternoon's special live panel discussion featuring an array of absolute legends of boundary-pushing art and publishing, kindly put together for us by Heather Buckley and Douglas E. Winter. Join me now in welcoming your superhuman host for this afternoon, Heather Buckley. Cheer for her across your living rooms.
Hello, everybody, and all the audiences at Chips at State. Is Heather Buckley. You may have known me from such movies as Al Adamson's doc that I did for David Gregory and The Ranger, and also a journalist for so long covering edgelord cinema for Dread Central and Fangoria. So I want to introduce our panelists, and I dedicate this panel to Mitch Davis. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And this one's for you, Mitch. So I'm introducing David J. Schow, novelist, essayist, book editor, and screenwriter, credited with coining the term splatterpunk in a reference to the wave of 1980s horror fiction writers, of which he was a part of, and brought to a new level of explicit outrageousness of the genre. His books include The Kill Riff, Seeing Red, and The Outer Limits Companion. His screenplays include The Crow, The Hills Run Red, Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre The Beginning. He wrote an episode of the first season of Shudder's series Creepshow: The Finger. His recent works include a short story collection, Monster Movies, and an updated edition of the collectible stories, The Eye.
Smartly done. Thank you.
We now introduce John Skipp, novelist, book editor, musician, screenwriter, and filmmaker. His books include the seminal splatterpunk novel, The Light at the End of the Tunnel, The Art of Horrible People, The Bizarro Encyclopedia, in collaboration with Heather Drain. His work as a screenwriter includes Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, and Tales of Halloween. It's very funny when I was hanging out with John Skipp, I saw your residuals for Nightmare on Elm Street 5. He wrote an episode of the first season of Creepshow, Times as Tough as Months in Muskie Holler. He directed a segment in the anthology Tales of Halloween, and he just directed the film Doppelbanger. He's a recent recipient of the J.F. Galland's Lifetime Achievement Award as part of the 4th annual Splatterpunk Awards.
That's me.
Hi,
everybody.
And then we bring on to the stage Stephen R. Bissette, comics creator, film and literary critic, and historian, perhaps best known for his highly influential 1980s run of the comic book Swamp Thing in collaboration with Alan Moore and others. Starting in 1988, he edited and published the boundary-pushing horror comic anthology Taboo, for which emerged the classic graphic novel From Hell by Alan Moore. Stephen can currently be seen in the documentary bonus features of the Arrow films Weird Wisconsin. His nearly 700-page book, Midnight Monographs, The Brood, analyzing David Cronenberg's The Brood, is available from Electric Dream House.
Howdy, y'all. Thanks for having me.
Christina Ward, writer, editor, publisher, and publicist, vice president of Feral House and Process Media. Feral House has published books such as Apocalyptic Culture, edited by founder late Adam Parfrey, and Nightmare of Ecstasy by Rudolph Gray, which was adapted into the Tim Burton film Ed Wood. She's also a food historian, expert in food preservation. Now we bring to the stage David Kerekes, writer, book and magazine editor, publisher. Books include Killing for Culture, Volume 1, an illustrated history of death films from Mondo to Snuff, Killing for Culture, Volume 2, from Edison to Isis, and a new history of death on film. He has been the editor of the underground periodical Headpress, the Journal of Sex, Religion, and Death. He has co-founded the eclectic publishing company, Headpress Books. And then we finally bring to the stage a guy who helped me put this all together, who I met while doing extras for Arrow's Candyman, the legendary Douglas E. Winter, novelist, critic, book editor, biographer, and attorney, editor of the classic horror anthology Primeval, has written biographies on Stephen King, Clive Barker, author of the Bram Stoker award-winning novel Run, and short stories including Less Than Zombie and Splatter, A Cautionary Tale. He's also an accomplished lawyer working in Washington, D.C. To our panelists.
Hello there.
So I want to start this off because this Transgressive Urge is a panel that I was very interested in put together, being interested in taboo subjects, taboo art, and sort of the genesis of that as an artist. You know, how almost this is like a vocational calling. So I think like John Skipp, what did you say in your Facebook post? Like to fuck shit up. Like, why is this all these artists God-given right to do this? But I'm going to start with a quote from actually Primeval, which is very interesting. When I came to Doug with this idea, it's sort of like a palate cleanser and sort of what we're talking about. So this is from his introduction. Great horror fiction has never really been about monsters, but about mankind. It shows us something important about ourselves, something dark, occasionally monstrous, and usually in bad taste. Its stories proceed from the archetype of Pandora's box, the intense conflict between pleasure and fear that is latent when we face the forbidden and the unknown. In horror's pages, we open the box, exposing what is taboo in our ordinary lives and test the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Its writers literally drag out terrors from the shadows and force us to look upon them with despair or relief. Doug, what were you trying to get at when you're writing this section about taboo in your seminal work, editing work Primeval?
I think most of all at the time, I was trying to dispel the myth of horror as a genre and to try to help people understand that horror is something far broader. And we can find it in all kinds of fiction, film, and art. That the real point of horror was exactly what we're going to talk about today, and that's transgression, pushing at the boundaries as much as possible. And that horror fiction in and of itself is something that's going to try to test our moral beliefs, test our moral thinking. It's going to inevitably indulge in the grotesque, and it's going to rip up the body as well as the mind. That introduction was meant to try to get people thinking beyond the normal box of horror fiction and also not feel cozy within that box, but to realize that what they should be doing is literally going out and trying to upset people.
So to follow up,
why?
That's what I was going to go to you, John, right away. When did you decide that your oeuvre in life would be to upset people?
Well, I mean, when I was a little kid, I had a fever that scared the fuck out of me. They had to Jacob's ladder me, throw me in a bathtub full of ice cubes to make the monsters stop coming down the walls. Years later, I moved to Argentina and saw police with machine guns, traffic cops with machine guns in the streets. Somewhere in all of this, I realized I was really, really afraid, and I didn't want to be afraid anymore, and that I had to face all the shit that was fucking with me. And then I saw a culture that routinely lied to itself and everybody in it. And I was like, wait, didn't you just see what I just saw? Because that was fucked up, right? And it just sort of felt like a moral imperative to address the damage and not be a candy ass about it because this shit was for real. And also I discovered that I really liked doing that.
Now, Christina, I was going to ask from a nonfiction perspective, but almost a narrative perspective, because I think like I'm talking to you, we're talking about David, is the idea of the cultural narrative of transgression that something like Feral House and the work that you've done with it has captured, especially I know for me, looking at apocalyptic culture at some point in real life and going into the sacred text and almost seeing what John Skipp was saying, is that it's out in the world and therefore I bring it into my work.
Right. And so where Feral House and where my work and even prior to Feral, it focuses is on that reality, the nonfiction. And that's the chasm a bit. What's interesting to talk to people working in transgressive fictional environments is we've always worked to, and what's interesting to me is the transgressive made real. I mean, and highlighting the people, the works, and the crime, the horror of the reality. And I think that by bringing that to people, it becomes People have accused us of making it so, of manifesting it by printing it, which we all know is just bullshit. But at the same time, we think it's important, and I still think it's important to bring forward those ideas, to know that there are transgressive ideas that real people believe and think, and things that have been done, and people need to know these things. And that's still our mission at Feral House, is to shine those lights. And I think, and that's where it serves, I think, sometimes as that counterpoint to the horror, the fictional aspect of it. It becomes, for every real life, I'm in Wisconsin, Steve. So for every real life Ed Gein, you get a Norman Bates.
That is incredibly profound. I'd also say from the perspective of the horror fan, that it's always been okay to like even extreme content when it's narrative, but when you start sort of like going mondo in a sense, and tracking serial killers and looking at these books, a lot of even people within the horror fan culture who loves all the gore and all the rubber monsters feel that is always too far. And I had this conversation with Miguel Rodriguez from Horrible Imagining Film Festival, of those horror fans out there who watch things like Live Leaks, who read about serial killers.
Right. So now you're transgressing against the transgressors. So again, it's something that we just touched on a little earlier, is, everybody's personal taste. And it's also a discovery process for yourself. What are the things, your personal taboos? And so I'd be interested in hearing what everybody else thinks about what is a transgressive art for them.
Who wants to take that one on? Steve Bissette.
To me, the issue with being an artist, a writer, a historian, archivist, fan of transgressive media, of creating it and of consuming it, if you will, is nobody needs my permission. My personal taboos are beside the point. In fact, a lot of the friction points I see today in the year 2021, not just as a creator and as somebody who is continually digging into where did this stuff come from? When did it become so transgressive that the authorities have to shut it down or began to step on it? I've also seen it on the more intimate level in a classroom as a teacher at the college level. Students who will object to transgression committed, if you will, by a classmate, and yet they are producing work equally or more transgressive and expect everyone to accept it. We're starting to really hit those walls every day, every hour, every minute. We see it on social media. We see it in our politics. We see it in what passes for social interactions like this one, which has nothing to do really with being in a room with real people. We would be having a very different panel right now if we were all physically in the same space. But, I go back to, interesting as it is, what might my personal taboos be? I think that's beside the point, because if I'm someone expecting others to ask my permission, I've missed the point already. If I'm really going to try to not wear blinders as a creator, as an artist, as a writer, I think it's beyond hypocritical of me to expect everyone to respect my blinders, if you will.
So I think you're talking about the strong idea about taboo and consent, right?
Sure. And I bumped against it all my life. Part of why you were asking at the beginning, why did we get into this? Well, I was raised Catholic. And need I say more? And I figured out at quite a young age, 5 or 6, that what was taboo was the important stuff. And if it wasn't important, it wasn't taboo. Yeah. And this was sort of a conundrum that drove everything. And as I got older, I kept hitting those walls. We tried to show, we did show Paul Bartel's film, Private Parts, a 1972 film that's a pretty terrific satire of psycho films. Because we advertised it as a Halloween ultra-violent show, the nonviolence class on our Johnson State College campus chained the theater doors shut with the audience in the theater. Okay, so they created a life-threatening hazard by trying to make their statement about nonviolence. And when I went and spoke to the class, which became a requirement that the administration set up for the professor of the class and myself, because now we were both transgressors, my first question was, who in this classroom has seen this movie? None of them had. And that's usually my constant problem with this dialogue.
So I'm going to jump in because, you know, it's interesting, Stephen, that you took the kind of the idea that way. I think that the intent is that our own personal ideas of taboo inform our work in general. But you're right, in so much as then everybody brings their personal prejudices to the idea of what is taboo and those definitions, which of course inform what becomes transgressive. I think to the larger point is we're not trying to, with the publishing nonfiction, aren't really trying to serve all masters in that way or try to satisfy a general readership or anybody really. We focus on things that are personally interesting to us, that are then informed, and then you make that art and you put it out into the world and people react. And to me, any type of emotional reaction, whether you love it or hate it, is good. If I'm eliciting a response, good. And so, and that's the beginning of that conversation. And that's, you know, the start of, I think, of any transgressive art.
Also, the response is far more powerful, I think, when you're working in this milieu. Correct.
And what I find it as a woman creating art, whether, you know, physical art, writing, publishing books, is the reaction is quite different than if a man created it. It's very different. And so what most people who are coming as consumers of transgressive art, whether they're conscious of it or not, treat women creators very differently than they treat men.
Ooh, can we get a little bit more of that as someone who's also female edgelord?
Sure. Is usually you're carrying, as a woman creator, you're carrying a lot more baggage, cultural baggage. So if you are a parent, I have a child who's much older now, but yeah, if you're a parent, again, that you're subject to a judgment, especially as a mother. You know, we can't equate those father to mother in the world of transgressive art and that creation of, as well as you're subjected to a sexualized kind of judgment and harassment for making that people will make assumptions in whatever the form of the transgressive art you're making is people will make an assumption that it's somehow a personal story to you. So if you're doing something that includes any kind of sex violence in a transgressive format, people will assume, for example, any type of art writing that talks about rape, for example, people then make an assumption that that's some sort of subconscious desire on a woman's part, for example, when in fact, that's never the case, but right. There you go. Men especially make these types of judgments on transgressive art created by women.
And we're also in a space when it comes to true crime. So I know a lot of that is at Feral House. True crime has been embraced in a very strong way in the last few years by women.
Yes, it's an interesting psychological thing, is that just as studies have done with children watching light horror film. I think everybody, especially as Fantasia Fest, has had that rite of passage in Canadian of watching The Peanut Butter Solution, right? Of it's a genuinely early scary film for children. But again, we've done enough psychological studies to know that in that act of scaring kids, that act of experiencing fear in a relatively safe environment, i.e. in a book, in a movie, helps us build our sense of psychological safety and resilience. And so women watching true crime or listening to true crime, recent studies have shown is that's a way to, yes, it's entertaining, but it's also a narrative, a way to tell ourselves stories when women are encountering exponential increases of domestic violence, sexualized violence. By hearing those stories, it becomes a way to build up a psychological resilience.
Dave and I have often talked about horror as a survivalist literature to the extent that it makes people think about what they might do when the shit comes down, and gives examples of people whose courage or absence thereof, whose resilience or absence thereof, whose ability to think on their feet and keep the horrible thing from getting worse is part of what characters often do in these stories. And we watch them live or die by their decisions, and we see what the fuck they're made of. Dave, you gonna talk?
I'm waiting.
All right, so Dave, you're
one of the
what
things
John Skipp has said.
Okay.
One of the
All
things
the Dave, all
go
the
ahead.
Dave we need to get to.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, for me, the art came after the transgression, if you see what I mean. And I grew up with a keen interest in odd films, so I would go out and devour any book I could find, which back in the early 80s wasn't that many. So I amassed this little library. But then when video cassettes came out in Britain, you probably all know this, but we had the Video Recordings Act 1984, which clamped down on any unclassified film. And at that point, it galvanized a group of me and friends to put together Headpress.
Ooh.
And so it was a reaction to that,
Yeah.
that Headpress kind of found itself. But at the same time, which is really interesting, there was something in the air, because we kind of knew there was something going on. And I look at the 60s counterculture as preceding this in a way. But in being in Manchester in Britain at the time, we were very much aware that watching these films, collecting these films was suddenly taboo. So we thought, why is this? Why can we not see these films? And the magazine came out of that. And the weird thing is, one of the remits we had was, let's start a magazine, but let's not write about films. Because there was an explosion of film fanzines, horror fanzines, and we kind of just wanted to do something which was perhaps a little more interesting. But at the same time, like I say, there was all these little peripheral kind of fanzines cropping up as well. And it was going to a bookshop called Compendium in London that had this kind of feed your head section. And we found Feral House's Apocalypse Culture there. And we looked at it and we thought, this is it. Someone's got here first. And that was our kind of immediate reaction. So there was definitely something going on. And I think it's, so while we had the kind of Video Recordings Act in Britain, there was something, there was a zeitgeist. And I don't know if you know, but I remember an interview with Dave Davis of the Kinks being asked why so many beat bands sprung up in the 60s from all these different isolated towns. There was no connection between them. There was no internet, but they just seemed to happen. And Dave Davis said there was something in the air. It was a zeitgeist. We just all felt it. And I think that in a way is what happened back in the 80s and 90s.
And David J. Schow, you gave it a name at some point, because I was very fascinated reading Fangoria and Gorezone magazine. It was during that time period, I tell people, sort of someone from a counterculture punk rock perspective, it was like the wave of taboo that I remember in my life. It's sort of like it was moving through the 80s and sort of stopped in 1993. It was all, but I had to do research at the time because of my generation as an artist. But I mean, looking for Schow's books at like Borders in the mall, trying to get Kill Riff was something that I was always trying to do, because it was like this secret taboo thing that was always, it was also mail order specific to try to find these works.
The invention of splatterpunk as a rubric was almost accidental, and it certainly was one of those kind of party things, you know, that was maybe not intended to hold the weight that it engendered. It burned hot and bright and fast. And what happens if you make a loud noise to get everybody's attention? Well, you better damn well do something to merit that attention, or your audience is going to toddle off to the next freak tent. Now that I think everybody understands the obligation of an artist to be provocative. And one of the things to do is seek out those things that, for better or worse, may provoke responses from people. Frequently the question, kind of like the question that was put to John Skipp, a lot of people, when you get into certain areas like horror stories, people always want to know what happened to you as a child to make you this way, to want to tell this kind of story. Then in my case, it's like, I chose to do this. Nothing happened to me as a child. I chose to do this. This is the only way that I have ever made my living, ever. Mm-hmm. So once I got past that ride or die phase, I must have been doing something right. But in the matter of provoking and transgression, I especially wanted to ask David and Christina, right now, we live in such an eggshell, culturally sensitive environment that don't you feel that we're just surrounded by taboos now?
Yeah, it's because I no longer think of, we used to get lumped with this label, we were transgressive publishers, and we also used to bandy this about us out, we're a transgressive publisher. And I'm not sure whether we actually ever believed that, to be honest. We just like to do the stuff we like to do. But it was a kind of handy moniker, but now I wouldn't say that. In fact, I think Headpress as the magazine stopped with the internet, because at that point, there just seemed to be no point trying to do this weird shit anymore, because it's all around. Mentioning serial killers just a moment ago, we used to collect books and read about the serial killers, but now Netflix seems to be, which is everyone's got Netflix, and that seems to be serial killer central. So, what is the taboo anymore? I don't know if we need to think like that. Just do what you like to do.
Well, on the other hand, though, we're in this crazy, just look at this year alone. We're in this crazy culture where for the first time, you can go on any venue and buy Ingagi, a 1930 exploitation film that was lost since the 30s, and sort of a forbidden text in a way, because it's racist and it's xenophobic and it's this horrible caricature of Africa and involves miscegenation. But we still can't legally buy and watch Ken Russell's The Devils, a film from 1971, because we're also in an environment where there are all these firewalls that are not invisible. They are very real, right? In my own collection, I have 2 bootlegs of The Devils and 1 legal release from the British Film Institute that's the cut version.
Right.
And it's absurd to me that the same corporation that pours how many versions of The Conjuring and the Killer Doll movies, and yet for some reason they have this edict against this one Ken Russell film. Well, obviously it's an important film, right, because it's not allowed to be seen. So we have the illusion of access, and I believe you're right, David, that with Netflix, which has become serial killer central, that sort of true crime environment that saturates everything has the appearance of being permeable and taboo shattering. And yet, one of the ultimate true crime films, The Devils, based on an Aldous Huxley, historical account of a 17th century incident in France, is not permitted to be on Netflix, isn't invited there. Warner Brothers, the proprietor, doesn't want it there. So we still have these very real taboos that we can even put names to.
So I would challenge, to answer the question, and as well as to challenge Stephen a little bit, is like what you're calling a taboo is more just, it's about business, capitalism. That means capitalism is a taboo. Somebody's making a choice somewhere, and I'm sure there's money involved. But for example, for Feral House, we did earlier publish, books on serial killers because it was interesting and it was access. You were able to write to a guy and he'd send you stuff. But at the same time, I don't look at that, David Kay does either, it's not necessarily transgressive. If it's on Netflix, if everybody's doing it, it's not necessarily transgressive anymore. To me, as a historian, it's much more interesting at this point in time to push back a little bit about some of these narratives, especially in North America, or Western culture narratives about morality, about our ideas about morality, and publish historical surveys, or as well as then actually older texts that blow that mythology apart, that we are essentially as existing human beings, we're just taboo busters. It's what we do. Everybody wants to sleep with their cousin or their brother, maybe, or do things that
I love
are
my cousin's brother.
right? If everything was cast aside and you could just do whatever you want, it would be a fantastical, terrible chaos. And again, all these cultural taboos, social contracts are to prevent the chaos from happening. And so again, it comes back to what is then transgressive. Something can be only transgressive in a place, in a time, against a specific culture. Which goes to say, like Stephen, you're pointing out the 30s movie, right. So now, where the movie was made, it wasn't really transgressive at all. But now, based on everything we're seeing in the cultural sensitivity, it's absolutely transgressive to try to disseminate that movie, even though it's accessible. But
point of fact, it was transgressive in its day. It was distributed out of the back of car trunks. It was not released through, a studio like Universal or MGM or whoever.
It was too racist even for Hollywood, is what you're saying?
Well, no, I mean, I won't dwell on it, but, because one studio, RKO, owned its own, this is when studios own their own theaters, which is very much like what we're seeing right now with streaming services, right? We're seeing corporations that provide content owning the venues of viewing the content, of experiencing the content. And at that time in 1930, Ingagi was transgressive because it promised nudity. Female nudity, which was, was a transgression at the time. And the workaround, and you're right, in that because it was Black women, that was more permissible than if it had been white women that were topless. But it was a transgressive film in its day, which made it a desirable exploitation film. It made a ton of money.
Sure. I mean, but poor Anthony Comstock. Good.
Well said.
We should. I think we all, and this is what's interesting in all of the just different areas that we work, is that I think we all have different ideas and specific definitions of what transgressive is. Sure. Because it was a movie in the 30s was against the Hays Code. I guess I wouldn't consider that transgressive. That's just against the Hays Code. So I think that this is where there's an interesting conversation too about how perceptions of transgressive art have changed and morphed. And it goes back to what Heather was saying and David was saying, is like, what does that mean for modern practitioners, if you will?
If I may build on that and pose a question to everyone, when in your career did you experience real pushback from something you had done that was transgressive? And I'll give an example. When we were publishing the anthology Taboo, we got busted by customs in every single English-speaking country, to the point where I was smuggling copies into Canada and into England to get contributors to Taboo their complimentary copies of their own work. And it was fascinating to go through that process, right? It was a mercantile threat in that it affected our ability to continue doing a book like Taboo. But on the other hand, it was also fascinating because we got our best review from New Zealand Customs, the only customs outfit that actually read the issue they had busted and passed it, saying, gee, this is an intelligent piece of work. This is presented in context. This is permissible for adults to buy in the country of New Zealand.
I want to hear Doug's answer to this question.
Same here. Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
Doug, when were you busted?
Okay. Interesting one, and it was all my own doing. I was the Washington Post censored a review I wrote of the collected short stories of J.G. Ballard because I referenced J.G. Ballard's "Why I Want to Fuck Ronald Reagan," and I did that because, like I said, it was of my own making. I wanted to see if a major metropolitan newspaper would actually publish that title, and of course, at that point in time, they didn't. I should say though that, and maybe more to the point, I wrote a short story called Loop, and this was it was a critique of the male gaze that concludes with a group of men gathering in a dingy hotel room to watch autopsy footage of a famous actress as if it's pornography. And a woman editor was considering the story, which she ultimately did take, but she said to me that she wasn't sure she wanted to print another story about women being cut up. And that taught me the kind of lesson, and it's sort of the Sam Peckinpah Wild Bunch legend. And I think it also goes to what Steve had to say, that sometimes people cannot get past the imagery. There's something about the imagery that strikes them in such a way that whatever your motive and however powerful your motive might be in telling the particular story and choosing that particular set of imagery, they can't get past the image. They can't get past the image to the actual story or to what the creator actually intended or was conveying. And I think that's something that all creators at some point in time confront. And you have to make that call. And to my mind, I think, we need to be brave. But sometimes creators end up in contexts like television, where it's all about compromise. So you have to make that judgment call about what you're doing, why you're doing it, whether you need money to continue existing, and think about the compromises. But when you're dealing with the transgressive, that I think, to my mind, is the major risk, is that you will simply, because of the imagery you chose, not be understood.
I would like to point out that I think the rational mind is a backseat driver, and that emotion really runs the show. That the thing about an image, like a piece of music, is that you immediately feel it and then try to consider what you think about it, and possibly either rationalize your love of it or your revulsion of it intellectually. But first you feel it. And so, yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things that Splatterpunk ran up against was if you had a particularly intense and fucked up set piece, that was the only thing that people remembered. Whatever subtleties you may have woven into the narrative that you were telling and all the reasons that you were trying to tell the story, the one thing they remembered was the fucking guy's head blowing up, or whatever that particular graphic moment was, as if the entire thing could be reduced to that. And that was a real hard obstacle for an awful lot of people to get over as they were attempting to gauge our place in the horror scene. It was like, oh, but you're the guy who did that.
And you'll never second guess what that transgressive image might be.
Yeah, you'll know.
What got us busted in more countries than anything was a single panel in the 500-page From Hell by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell of Prince Edward with an erection. That's what got us from Taboo busted again and again and again. That and S. Clay Wilson, which was no surprise to us.
Right. Well, let me jump in. Is Heather and a few people have already referenced Apocalypse Culture. Apocalypse Culture 2, there's a sequel. Yeah. It's rare, hard to find, because we cannot get a printer in the United States nor overseas to reprint it. They won't do it because of a singular image, and we're not willing to take it out. So everybody go home, run. If you've got your copy, go and take a look and see if you can guess which one it is.
I think that's important to just call back to an earlier thing. I think that's why the text narratives, especially of true crime, are doubly important now, because I don't want to be stranded with just the Netflix version of what these things were. Because Netflix, there's a lot of pitfalls there, folks. And if you understand anything about true crime narratives, and I do, it's like the incomplete reportage. It's barely reportage to begin with, and
it's not just that. I mean, my kids grew up with a different version of certain Disney cartoons than I grew up with. And my grandkids are growing up with different versions than my children grew up with, because they've since removed the cigarette from the mouth of of Lampwick
They
in
removed the
Pinocchio.
guns. They removed the guns from gunfights.
Well, there you go. And those are the kind of taboos that were never intended as transgressive. Those are the kind of shifts in the cultural landscape that, Christina, you were talking about right from the get-go. What was once acceptable social behavior and expected is now toxic, has become taboo in a way.
And another thing, to the point Christina raised, it's like, that's the one reason, that one of the things that I wish we had or could enjoy the most that we can't have because of commercial considerations, is to be able to read books and narratives with no attribution whatsoever, with no author name. So you don't know what sex they are, what color they are, what shape they are they an alien? It's like you don't know when you read the material, and then you can have a more honest reaction to it. I wish that could happen.
I was going to say the quality of a lot of the true crime stuff that we see on Netflix, they're more focused on procedural than actually the killer themselves, or to be different. I don't know I think people are watching the Netflix docs, but I don't know who's going back to watching the Iceman tapes. And we talk in a fictional sense, that is much different. I don't know if the murderinos are watching Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, Angst, Golden Glove. So there's a certain quality about those type of movies, even though at the surface bullet point level, true crime, serial killers, but it seems like the way things are handled, that there's a nuance to it that brings us to this place of sort of shock and extreme reaction, which on one hand, there's a huge audience like myself looking for that. But then I felt like when I wrote for Dread, Sunshine, and Fangoria, why I focused on these movies, because they're unbelievably misunderstood. Because as soon as you're shocking, you're dismissed.
Did any of you read the book The Five by Hallie Rubenhold?
Hallie's a genius.
It's a wonderful book in a world full of Jack the Ripper documentation. This book was like getting punched right in the face. I love it. She has to make a lot of assumptions about the material because the research was so sketchy, but I think her research was exemplary.
She's a fantastic writer and researcher. But I wanted to just jump on this idea and keep kind of, we talk the transgressive urge.
Stay in focus, yeah.
I guess I'm the border collie of the bunch. I'm going to wrangle everybody here.
Good.
So the idea then is that we're creating, and we Feral House and everybody, all of us here are still creating and putting out works that would be considered transgressive into the world. But it may look different. I know our work at Feral House may look different than it did in 1992, than what it looks like and what's coming up for 2022. But I assure people that in its way, it's still transgressive. What we found is we also have to be subversive. And so I'm wondering how everyone else is feeling about how they're presenting or creating work. Do you still consider, I know David Kay said not so much maybe transgressive, but how does that fit in? And are you doing anything differently to serve our commercial masters, and as well as then still get the art out?
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I think we have become more conscious of what we're doing because you cannot afford not to be. And going backtracking to a question a bit earlier, you don't see it coming when it comes. We couldn't get the first issue of Headpress published for one really, really curious reason that we didn't find out until several people turned us down. And the first issue contained an article that I'd written about source books, which was going back to that point I was making about aware there's something going on. And the source books article talked about amok, it talked about loon panics, but nobody read any of this. All they focused on was an advert I pulled from the Loon Panics catalogue, which was Uncle Fester's Home Explosives.
Right.
And somebody saw that. Several publishers printers saw that, and they would not print it because of that. one advert. It doesn't matter what else was in the magazine. And that brought a point to me that, wow, I didn't see that coming. And it's constantly, I didn't see the next thing coming. I got doorstepped when we did a book called Killer Comics, which was like a comic book about serial killers, but done in any way the artist wanted to. So some of them were kind of silly, some of them were kind of serious. But I got doorstepped by a guy who was a fan of Headpress, who'd bought the book, bought many of our books. And it turned out he asked to interview me, and halfway through the interview, he said, he threw a complete curveball, which I wasn't expecting, said, how would you react if the mother of one of the victims was standing in front of you? Because I actually do know one of the victims that you capture. And again, I didn't see that coming. So I think over the years, you learn survival instinct that be very careful, because you never know what's coming, but it will come.
Yeah, you do never know. Christina, when you referred to, and David, what you just referred to, what lost us our printer on Taboo 2 was that Alan Moore had drawn a map of London indicating the geographic connection between the church sites in London, and someone at the production house perceived it as a satanic pentagram and set a chain of events in motion that meant that no New England production house would do any work on that issue of Taboo. And we ended up actually having to get the book printed in one place, shipped at great expense to another location in the Boston area to be bound. And it instantly added like $10,000 to our book budget. And as any of you who've published can imagine, that killed it, For sure. Even when you think you're going to play it safe, after years of doing Taboo, fighting customs, fighting with printers, I thought, I'll do a dinosaur comic. And I did Tyrant, the birth of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And then I started getting the letters from intelligent design proponents and churches. And I found that my suitable for all ages dinosaur comic was as much of a hand grenade as anything I'd ever done in Taboo as a publisher and editor.
So I'd like to point out one thing, and then John wants to say something. One quick thing is, it's have we noticed that our gatekeepers, our door stoppers, have been one or two, a very small group of people exercising a personal moral judgment, then by doing that, then they are stopping everyone else who maybe wants to consume, see, be, partake of this art. And this is an issue, this is a real problem, and especially in the puritanical United States.
That is something that came up on our Q&A from Evan Jordan, because he's mentioning transgression is something that's regional. And then I also like when we discussed it a little, bring Doug into the conversation about it being sort of an era, the social, like the transgressive urge is also social political in a sense. It's sort of like how it blossoms into the world. So Evan asks, it's like, how much do you think transgressionism also differs most specific with regions, such as different areas of the United States having different concentrations of the type of people? As someone who spent years out west and graduated in Colorado, but now lives in the deep South, there's quite a difference as what's deemed acceptable media here versus there.
That's been a huge basis for censorship all over the country for a long time, is the dreaded community standards, right?
Well, that's the legacy of the 1973 Supreme Court ruling. Doug, you might be able to address that. I mean, basically, the Supreme Court, when it was presented with an obscenity case revolving around Deep Throat, they punted and said, well, okay, it's regional, right? And from that day forward, no joke, what is permissible to play in Kentucky cannot play in, say, Cincinnati, Ohio.
You get extradited.
Well, yeah. So, at that, from 1973 on, our entire legal framework that commercially we're functioning within as creators who are trying to produce work that's subversive, that's transgressive, that's challenging, that's confrontational, we have those very real impediments, which, as you say, Christina, sometimes might be the result of a single moral crusader in a position where they can set up a firewall. And in other cases, might be of a wider regional aspect, such as you've referred to, Heather, where you're dealing with, states.
Yes, from a political standpoint, the trial of Mike Diana and how he was asked not to draw. And that definitely came from down south, I believe.
Well, no, that actually started in Canada. There was a cartoonist who was one of the fanzine mailing buddies of Mike Diana. They would swap fanzines. The Canadian cartoonist, Marc La Liberté, was busted by the Royal Canadian Mounted. He had drawn a one-page comic in which Snoopy buggers Sally, Charlie Brown's little sister. So they busted Mark on bestiality charges, okay? And it failed in the courtroom because it was pointed out no act of bestiality had happened. Marc La Liberté in the real world was actually sitting at a table making marks with a pen on a piece of paper, and that in and of itself is not a transgressive act, nor is it an act of bestiality. The legal officials who were stymied in Canada reached out to officials in Florida because they had seen Boiled Angel in their evidence discovery of the Marc La Liberté material, and they alerted Florida officials to watch out for this guy down here who was trading comic fanzines with our guy up here that we could not prosecute in the way we wished. And that's how Mike Diana's case kicked into overdrive. And that's the kind of invisible transnational things that can happen if you're one of those people, even if you're a 17-year-old drawing a comic that only is reaching 200 people through the mail. And Christina, that goes back to your comment about Anthony Comstock. What Anthony Comstock, for those of you who don't know, was the man who basically was the first postal inspector and determined a lot of our obscenity laws in America.
So Doug, do you have sort of any notes on this idea of sort of the legal aspects of because there's the idea of the audience busting you, but then there's like the man busting you.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that there are not that many obscenity prosecutions anymore. You really require something that is, pretty much beyond the pale for a community or for law enforcement. The real issue, to my mind, with censorship is the way it's been pushed down, meaning we're talking about school boards, we're talking about schools. And it tends to always come down to the point that this is for the sake of the children, right? That we are securing the safety of the children by preventing materials that have some aspect to them we don't like as a local school board. And there, I think, that's where the demons are. It's very difficult if you're talking, it's very difficult to prevent the publication of any book in the United States on grounds of even on grounds of obscenity, and certainly it can't be done on grounds of transgression. But where there is localized distribution of things like films, there's always the alternative of boycotting, which can be done by local people who are upset and want to censor something. And as I said, there's always the possibility for local city councils, for school boards to do things addressed to specific access within their community. So it does have definitely a regional impact. It has a municipal impact in many cases, or a school district impact. But on the broader scale, if you're talking about things such as a New York publisher publishing a book throughout the country, you're rarely going to find that access to that book is going to be denied somewhere. And it's going to be very difficult to find someone prosecuting, and very rare.
Although Apocalypse Culture 2 cannot be printed, as Christina.
Not you, but see, that's a private act. That's a private act, though. That's not the man.
No, I understand.
Private enterprise, and and those are different things, because there's no First Amendment protection against private enterprise.
Right.
But there is First Amendment protection against the government.
Right. And I was going to just to what you were saying, Douglas, is that we find the marketplace too, as a capitalist marketplace, also serves as a form of moral enforcer. That, you know, the distribution networks for books, movie, whatever, and somebody alluded to earlier, Netflix streaming, they serve essentially as a morality police in a way about what is acceptable transgression, what's acceptable sexualization, sexualized fiction, what's acceptable violence for people to consume. Personally, as a publisher, we have, you know, one of the largest distributors in the world distributing our titles, but at the same time, you don't always find Feral House books, but you know, in every mom and pop bookstore, because fundamentally those distributors aren't really going to work very hard to get it in books. Those salespeople aren't. Those bookstores, you know, they're not going to stock these materials. And so again, the capitalism has become a more effective moral enforcer than like government per se.
Right.
I totally
and
got it.
There are two very good examples of that. If I can, John, I just very quickly, two very good examples of that, of two of the most transgressive books of the past 50 years. The first one, J.G. Ballard, I mentioned before, The Atrocity Exhibition, Doubleday pulped it. After they printed it, it barely was released. They decided it was too much. It had gone too far for many various reasons. So they pulped it. Fortunately, Grove Press picked it up and published it. But you know, that was their capitalist decision, as you say. And then, of course, 25 years later, we've got American Psycho. And, you know, the original publisher there did the same thing. They looked at the book and decided, oh, this is really offensive. This is really transgressive. They didn't understand the book and they refused to publish it after they had accepted and paid for it. And again, fortunately, I think it was Vintage picked it up and put it out. But for a long time, there was never even a hardcover version of American Psycho available in the United States. And those are two very good examples, because both of those books are very memorable transgressive books. And if you sort of set out the Transgression Hall of Fame in terms of novels, they're going to be there. Right. So I'm sorry, John.
No. I'm really glad that you did that. I would just like to point out that capitalism is entirely amoral, and they will sell just about anything if they think they can make money off of it. And then a lot of these decisions are based on them thinking that they're going to lose money by putting this thing out. At the same time, when we were first doing this splatterpunk thing, images that would not be permitted on television. Dawn of the Dead couldn't get an R rating when it came out in 1978, 79?
Yeah, 78. Yeah.
And then by the early 90s, the shot of the black dude getting his head blown off from the first 15 minutes of Dawn of the Dead was used as a comedy throwaway gag in a movie called Idle Hands with television teen idols starring in it. And stuff that would completely have gotten you banned in the video nasty era was routinely shown on cop shows on network television. So the opportunity to show fucked up things are so ubiquitous right now that I think it really is hard for something to poke its head through and go, out of all the fucked up stuff in the world, this is particularly fucked up and needs to be stopped. In many ways, the illicit image is now everywhere. And I found myself often going back to a Sandra Bernhardt line from back in the 80s. Love is the only shocking act left, because we all know how fucked up we are now. We've all seen into every nook and cranny of our nightmare souls. We see what we're capable of as a species. But then to be actually able to still meet each other in the eye with anything other than contempt or cynicism is a little miracle in itself. That's just a way to flip the map and just go, yeah, man, what can't you show now?
That's very interesting, because when I was talking to Gaspar Noé about his film Love, and like David Kerekes, as you mentioned, being blindsided. He was blindsided that it was considered so taboo, so transgressive, so subversive, and it's just a movie about a relationship and sex. It's like, I'm made irreversible. I had no idea that people would come for me for love. I was interviewing him. He was in the, like, he and all the PR people were in the midst of dealing with love, which is very funny. But David Schow, you were gonna add?
Oh, do you recall who the woman was that was just recently thrown under the bus of cultural appropriation because she wasn't the race she was writing about in a novel?
Yes.
That's American Dirt.
Who was that, Christina?
Her name is Jeannie something or other. But the book was American Dirt, and so and that was a very kind of, in the literary world, it was like a chick lit. It wasn't like high art or anything. It was kind of a pop novel about, a well-to-do Mexican woman who's somehow involved with cartels by accident, and her escape across the border. What really, here's the two things though, is it was still, even though the kind of that small vocal literary community was up in arms about the cultural appropriation, i.e. a white woman writing as a Mexican experience. But at the same time, the book was a bestseller. So the consumers didn't really react too much about the internal kerfuffle about, authorial provenance. They didn't care. They just wanted the rip roaring thriller.
But the book was
bad publicity is great publicity.
What was it, David?
The book was not pulled or suppressed or anything, though.
No,
right?
not at all.
Okay.
No, it was criticized for poor taste, for sure. But no, bestsellers. I think it was still one of Oprah's picks or something.
Yeah, it was an Oprah pick. John, you used the phrase "flip the map." I think part of what happens that also blindsides us is we don't recognize when the map gets flipped, in a way that even those of us who love this kind of media are always looking for, whatever that thing that's going to emerge out of the woodwork that'll be the next, I don't know, Night of Living Dead or Eraserhead or American Psycho. What really busted the mainstream culture open as to transgressive graphic imagery suddenly being acceptable even to the MPAA was Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. And after that, the MPAA sort of couldn't say to the people that were producing R-rated horror movies, well, you can't show that anymore, because we had just endured 2 hours of that, The
Passion of the Christ. The Passion of the Christ is a really fine Italian horror movie.
Well, it is. And they were bringing, and it was an incredibly successful breakthrough hit on the Christian film and the mainstream circuit. And that's what suddenly meant that sort of 10 to 20 year period that had followed Dawn of the Dead, getting out there as an unrated film and actually having an impact culturally and commercially, being stepped on by the studios, everything busted open again in very unexpected ways. Some of it was of interest to us. Some of it might be the kind of work that some of us might find appalling or the opposite of transgressive or subversive. Right. But that still is what flipped the map, was that particular artifact. And
I think it did because it was an acceptable storyteller. It's Mel Gibson, who's a reactionary right-wing Catholic, telling this story in this way. So, I mean, if you contrast that to what 20 years earlier, what Scorsese did, so with The Last Temptation of Christ, I mean,
it still wasn't a safe commercial vehicle. It was in a foreign language that nobody speaks anymore, a subtitled film. In terms of the commercial parameters that most theater-going cinema audiences are paying money for, it was a dog. It was a loser. There's no way it could work, and it did work.
Well, I'm actually going to align a little bit with Christina, because it's like, the people who are allowed to transgress and taboo and get away with it, there's a certain privilege there. And I think there's a privilege to Mel Gibson, where I'm going to point to like one of my favorite films, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. It's like that movie, because of its content, maybe because it's like of everyone involved, they decide like, yeah, we can put it through the ringer. We're not going to stand up for it. We're going to, you know, cut it to hell, because it's a horror movie. It's a horror movie. It's not an important work. It's one of my favorite of the series. But yeah, I know, Dave, that you went through that, and then hearing that something like Passion of the Christ, it's like, yeah, that's fine. Mondo.
Heather, there's another element there.
To please the MPAA. 11 passes. We lost our entire ad budget. But enough about
Doug, you were about to say.
I was simply going to say, Heather, that, and by no means am I going to defend Mel Gibson. But really, I think what drove that was Jesus Christ.
Exactly.
And believe me, you had people, you know, it was a family movie.
Yeah, I agree.
It was a family snuff movie, you know, basically. Yeah. And you know, people by the busloads going to see it, taking their kids. Let's all go see it. Let's see it twice. It's such a moving thing. And, you know, that's, I think, what really powered that through and made that movie, you know, untouchable to the MPAA.
Nobody thought that movie was going to. Nobody thought that movie was going to make a dime. But yeah, Christians mobilized, and I mean, the only exposed rib cage that we should be able to see inside of is that of Christ our Savior, and that was just sort of the way it worked out, because it's like that pain is the pain that that saved the world. And I have a sister who actually had a religious conversion as a result of seeing that film. She and her husband had a religious conversion living in Kansas, seeing that film, and they went from being lefties to far righties as a result of seeing that. They had their come to Jesus moment when they saw his spine exposed. And it's really, really fascinating, but it's true. And yeah, they cashed in because it was a Christ thing. It was like the most pro-Jesus movie of the, you know, of 50 years, since like, you know, The Robe or something, Jesus Christ Superstar. And yeah, it was the transgression that was acceptable. It was, they were willing to look at that dark place, because when they saw how we punished the Christ, it was time to come and get us.
Tina?
Christianity is a death cult, and they finally got their dream movie.
They got their splatter movie.
Right.
Yeah, it was. It's a Christian splatter movie.
To me, it's not transgressive. It's not transgressive.
I didn't say it was transgressive. I said it opened the gates for what followed.
Right.
You know, without the passion, we wouldn't have had, and I'm not championing any of these, I find them interesting in different ways, but we wouldn't have had Hostel. We wouldn't have had Saw. We wouldn't have had these franchises that were trotted out that went far beyond anything that David Schow and his creative partners on Texas Chainsaw 3 were permitted to do. So I'm not arguing it was transgressive, Christina, nor am I championing it. I'm just recognizing that's the artifact that flipped the map.
Are you talking about from an MPA rating perspective? I remember posting on Twitter going like, what kind of horror movies we need? We need NC-17 movies. And I was literally shocked, but my Twitter followers were like, they're not interested in that. And to me, it's like, that's the films that I make in my life. It's like, if I could get an NC-17 rating, I would just wear it as a badge of honor that I was able to, you know, bug the MPA that much. I know the last time the MPA lost their mind was in House That Jack Built, because they released the unrated cut too close to the R-rated cut in theater. And that was that. And I was talking to people at IFC, and I said, that's a blessing. Like what John Skipp was talking about, controversy sells, because the MPA has cared about nothing for so many years. And then to target House That Jack Built, it'll only be good. And recently working on looking at the ad for the old film Nightmare, and that they took like the worst, you know, this movie is trash and horrible, and then wearing it as a badge of honor. And even talking about that, is that why everyone continues walking this sort of like sacred path of the transgression through the slings and arrows?
Well, some people take the transgressive path because it's a life passion. I mean, to I'll ask this of David Kay, because you're in a country where, you know, not that long ago, there was a case history of the publisher of Lord Horror, David Britton, who actually did jail time because of what he published, and because, didn't he have a bookstore, David?
He did.
Yes.
Savoy.
Yeah, the Savoy
Yeah.
Bookshop. And,
Yeah.
you know, there was somebody who was committed to, whether you considered it good, bad, interesting, uninteresting, he was committed to producing, fostering, because other creators wrote and drew work that appeared in his publications, and getting out there transgressive comic literature and transgressive novel, Lord Horror, and paid a big price for it, which here in America, you know, as Doug pointed out, it's very rare to have obscenity trials, and Mike Diana is sort of, you know, the poster child for that, because he is the rare exception to that. You know, I believe he is the only American artist ever found guilty of obscenity in the history of our country. Whereas in England, it's a very different situation. I mean, I don't know what kind of risks Headpress have taken.
Yeah.
I was not afraid of losing my family, my home, my livelihood while publishing Taboo, but watching what happened with David Britton, whoa.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing with David Britton and Savoy, I think they were tried for both Lord Horror, the novel, and the comic book.
Yes.
And I think the case against the novel was overturned, but it was a comic book that they did him on. I'm pretty sure that
yeah, I believe you're right, because and this goes back to what Doug said. The images are often a more vulnerable and easy target than the written word.
Because the court couldn't see the comic book as anything but children's books in a way. But the novel had literary merit, and they couldn't do them on that. But for me, I actually do not set out to be writing about something I consider transgressive, like Killing for Culture. I'd never set out to write with Dave Slater a book that was transgressive. These were things that were very interesting to us, and we were passionate about, and we were fascinated by. So that's how we approached that.
Has anyone approached their work with the need to be provocative at the forefront?
Yeah.
It's more organic than that. These things suggest, or the stuff that I write suggests how it wants to be written as I write it. And frequently I need to leave that latitude in for it to surprise me that way. Otherwise, I won't get anything out of creating it.
Right.
You know, what made me want to draw horror comics was a Greg Irons, Tom Veitch underground horror comic, Skull number 6, A Gothic Tale, which so horrified me at the age of, 16, that when I turned the page at one point, I dropped the comic on the ground. It was as if I turned the page and a scorpion was in my hand. And the minute that happened, my first thought was, I want to do this to people. So to answer your question, Heather, yeah, that impetus drove my career for probably 20 years. And once we lost the Comics Code with the work we did together on Swamp Thing, that Alan Moore, John Tollivan, Rick Veitch, myself, editor Len Wein, editor Karen Berger were doing together, that kind of scratched that itch, and doing Taboo got me over that hump where I didn't feel that need anymore. I moved on to other things with my creative life, where now, David Schow, what you just said, I can align myself with you, and David Kay, I can align myself with you, where I do what interests me. I no longer have that need to be transgressive, because we got to do that with Swamp Thing, and I got to do that collaboratively with the many creators that were part of Taboo. But that was the impetus. I mean, that was the real impetus. I wanted to kick shit up, and I wanted to push a childlike form. Horror comics have been locked in the language of pre-1955 comic book culture, right? What EC Comics had done prior to 1955 was considered the be-all and end-all. And I subscribe to the very introduction you read aloud that Doug wrote, that horror was so much more than that.
Yeah.
I believed it was one of the genres fueled by emotion, and that the potential to create awe and to create a sense of the uncanny and to open one's eyes to all these aspects of life that other genres are afraid to go near was the power of doing horror comics. And so for me, it really was a driving force for like 20 years of my life, easily.
Well,
To
Steve,
tell hard truths.
Let's go to David Kay and then Christina Ward.
Yeah, Steve, Dr. Wortham's Comics and Stories.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that filtered through to Britain. I had no idea how they ever got through, probably in the bottom of crates, ballast for ships or something. But I remember seeing that. I thought, this guy, he's clued in. I didn't know who you were. But there was one story in there that made me feel physically sick.
Which story, may I ask?
Oh, it was some guy locked in a cage who was melted.
Sell food.
Yeah,
And that's a story that I always think is going to come back to bite me on the ass. It was about a black man locked in a cell where he had no food, no light, no anything. And it was a pun. He discovers he's in the cell of a wasp's chamber. And what is a wasp but a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? But presenting it as a straight-ahead horror story where everything is real, it was pretty much the story of a human being trapped in an insect's life cycle. And this was published prior to Alien coming out, which was the film that really popularized putting us on that end of the food chain. I'm honored that I made you nauseous, David.
Christina Ward, and also are you honored that you've with all your work have sort of provoked and excited the audience in a sense?
So what I wanted to come in from a nonfiction to answer then your question, which is that I kind of mentioned earlier, alluded to, is I've always found that the reality of living and the historical lives is much more terrifying and than any kind of novel of fictionalization. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I'm from Wisconsin. My relatives are in Wisconsin death trips. That's where my people are from. So our reality is much darker, I think, than maybe other folks. And so I think, so there's no specific urge to be provocative just for that sake alone. But I think one of my animating things in the work with Feral House, and then, assigned my own work, is to bring that historical context as well as then the actual history of those horrific things, is to remind people that we're not so soft, we're not so moralistic, nor are we so religious. And so by bringing those stories that ultimately are transgressive, because it shifts that narrative, it upends it. When I published a memoir of a 16-year-old a drug-addicted prostitute from the late 1800s, people are upset because that's not what they think their great-grandmothers were doing. So, so my role has always been, and what I'm always trying to do is bring stories that shift people's ideas of what reality is or what reality was, and to upend the history a bit. And that becomes transgressive because can be that reality is horrifying.
Well, it's something that we want to suppress as a self, which I think is very interesting, that there's almost like a taboo evangelical nature, as at some point, and I'd love to hear this from the panel, is that when you realize that the world was like that, but then also as an artist, the need to share, because I think even movies like Todd Solondz is that he sees a certain world with Death of a Thousand Cuts, and most people don't want to believe that that's our reality, that it is also the truth of the human species and the human condition, amongst with all like our Lifetime movies, Disney movies, that this is also truth. But also, sure, Christina, want the drive to share that and teach that. I think it's very fascinating. When I first read a lot of this literature, watched a lot of these movies, it's like, I did say, it's like, you have seen part of the world that I've also seen. Yeah. And there's a comfort in that, in a sense.
And it goes to what I was saying, is about building psychological resilience. It builds character and resilience, that when we accept that is it in, I'm just thinking, it's a family joke of, referencing Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, do we know many children at age 7 you're going to give the shotgun to and walk away from on? Not today. But you know, those are realities that
today you got to tell them not to drink this stuff in the battery.
Right. So,
you know, in the car. But to just touch back on a previous thing, the one thing that I didn't expect from doing this kind of thing was the way that we get surrounded by gatekeepers. And we have to keep an eye on the gatekeepers. I'll give you a very pallid, but a very general example. The MPAA. Nobody knows how it's put together. That David, that's the ratings board in the United States for movies. They determine whether things fly or fail to this day. And having been a victim of the MPAA, when Jurassic Park came out, they said, we have to rate this movie PG-13 because it will frighten children. Again, they're hiding behind the skirts of children to get their agenda across. And I'm saying, wait a minute. Some of my fondest memories of my childhood are of being frightened exactly that way. And you would take that away.
I think Doug was telling me a great story over email when you first was sort of like frightened as a child and you almost felt like this is the path.
Well,
same thing.
You know, my fright as a child was in church. I grew up as a Southern Baptist in Southern Illinois. Sunday morning service, Sunday night service, Wednesday night service. And it was all about hell and damnation and the blood of the Lamb and soldiers in the Lord's army. And if you didn't live that life, you were damned, you know, to eternally to the most brutal concept of hell you could imagine. Constantly having this beat into me. But the experience came that the church itself, the building, was a very scary place, and it had a second floor balcony that had a railing that was about 2 feet tall. So it sort of beckoned you to either jump or fall over it. And I couldn't get anywhere near this. Balcony. And sometimes I'd have to go up to like a class, you know, and I would like walk on the wall on the other side. But the experience came one night. I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and I had forgotten something. And it was a Sunday night service, so it's nighttime, and I'd forgotten something up in the sanctuary, and I ran up to get it. And while I'm down in the middle of this sanctuary, someone turned off the power. So the lights went out completely. And I was standing in this huge sanctuary, completely in the dark. And it was a very scary experience. There was this sense of fear there that I was touching something. And now that it was completely black, it was completely dark, I was fully exposed to something I couldn't see. And it wasn't just the sense of it being numinous, you know, it was a sense of that I was in contact with the beyond. And that's always been part of what I've, you know, tried to pursue in my writing, and what's driven a lot of my criticism is this whole notion that, you know, to reach the beyond, to see the dark, right, to feel the dark, you've got to breach something. You've got to get to the beyond. You've got to breach anything and everything that's in your path. And that includes all of these taboos. It includes all of these things we've been taught, for better or worse, about life and about death, and the need to really see beyond them. And I think that's what the best horror fiction is all about. I think it's what everyone on this panel has done, and has done extremely well. And believe me, I'm greatly appreciative to each of you who have been vastly entertaining to me, and also educational to me, and also just you know, have given me such an experience of the kind that, you know, that I want, and I think that I need. So you know, I think that's what transgression really should all be about in the end, and that's let nothing stand in your way, and whenever possible, knock those things down, knock the walls down.
We're not going to get any better than that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We've reached, we're sort of reaching to the end, and that seems an incredible antidote. Though. Clap, golf clap. So if we sort of feel, I think this is a very interesting conversation on sort of the urge, the need, and just sort of that we're a lot of these people on the panel were just born to do it. And as I sent Doug Winter the song from Natural Born Killers, Juliette Lewis singing "Born Bad," and I mean, sorry, we're just born bad. So I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank all our Johns, all our Davids, Doug and Steve and Christina. And I guess to close out, do we want to talk about just sort of where we can find you, where the fans can find you, where we can find the work, where they can contact you?
I'm on Facebook. I have new work coming out. In fact, I have a sketchbook that's coming out this week, which you can buy on, forgive me, Amazon.com. And I'm doing a lot of nonfiction work these days as well. Oddly enough, sort of following in Christina's and David Kay's footsteps. So anyway, I'm on Facebook. See you there.
John Skipp?
Yeah, me too. You know, it's really funny. I have a book coming out in October. It's called Don't Push the Button, which is entirely what we were just talking about.
And David Kerekes?
Headpress.com. You'll find me on there, the email addresses and everything.
Miss Christina Ward?
You can find us at feralhouse.com. I just want to point out, we have a book coming out in November that is purposefully fun and transgressive. We are publishing for the first time ever officially in the United States, the Eugene Le Pivoton's erotic drawings of the infamous penis series, as well as a very nice curation of 17th century dirty jokes, poems, vignettes, and the like. And then my book comes out in January, which is a food history analysis of the influence of cults and new religious movements on food. Huh.
Food.
I hope you get your own Food Network show.
Right. Where I stab people at the end. Thank you.
Doug Winter? Douglas?
Oh, you know, I really prefer to stay off the grid. You won't find me on Facebook. You could probably find me if you look hard enough. My next project, the one that's underway right now, and it's nearly done, is I am editing a collection of the short stories of a very well-known European horror film director for publication in the English language here in the States. But I can't say anything more about that.
And David J. Scott?
You'll find me on Facebook insofar as I go on Facebook to announce whatever is new. And the two principal things that are new is that Cimarron Street Books has undertaken a massive republication of all my collections and all my books. Eventually, we got 10 books out in a year. And these are all refreshed, remixed, redone, augmented, many more illustrations. And if anybody's interested in this stuff, the afterwards have all been expanded to explain everything. And the other thing you'll find announced on Facebook is we're halfway through my latest a comic book series for John Carpenter, which is simply called John Carpenter's Hell. Issue 4 just came out, and we have an 8-issue run of that. And those are the two primary things right now, apart from, you know, more stuff for Creepshow or whatever.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And so I wish you adieu and good night, and keep down your sacred path of being an edgelord and transgressor.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Doug, too.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody, for attending and listening to us.
Yes.